This is an overview of the respiratory system. Now, where is the respiratory system? The respiratory system upper part is in the face, represented by the nose, and the neck, represented by the nasopharynx, then oropharynx, then laryngopharynx, and the larynx. There is a vocal cord inside the larynx that acts as a valve and used for speech. This level of the vocal cord separates the upper respiratory tract from the lower. The lower starts from below the vocal cords down the trachea and then the main bronchi and the lungs. If the vocal cord separates the upper respiratory passages from the lower, can I see the vocal cord? Here it is. What is this view? It is a sagittal view of the larynx. What is the other name of the larynx? It is the voice box. Now, you can see at the tip of this arrow a structure that is the vocal cord, and this is the line passing through the vocal cord. Therefore, we have structures above it are called what? Are called upper respiratory passages, and structures below it are called lower respiratory passages. Questions about this sagittal view of the larynx. We have already seen the vocal cords, but there is another fold superior to it, and this is at the tip of this arrow. It is called the vestibular fold. It's a fold of mucous membrane, but it has no vocal cord. Therefore, it has another name called false vocal cord. What is our aim of the respiratory system? Our aim is to have these little balls called alveoli, and in this place there is exchange of gases between air in this alveolus and blood vessels, capillaries around this alveolus, and this is present where? It is present at the end of the terminal bronchiole. Why do we have terminal term? Terminal because it's the end of so many divisions of major respiratory passages. At the beginning they are called bronchus, and then primary bronchus, secondary bronchus, then bronchioles, and we have so many divisions of bronchioles, and the last bronchiole is called the terminal bronchiole. The terminal bronchiole is a structure which is going to divide into what is called respiratory bronchiole, and this bronchiole, although it is a passage, alveoli are going to open into these bronchioles, and the gas exchange will start in this alveolus. This is the first alveolus that we can see. It is opening into a respiratory bronchiole. Then the respiratory bronchiole is also going to divide, and these divisions are going to be the alveolar duct, then alveolar sacs, and all these structures, the respiratory bronchioles, the alveolar ducts, the alveolar sacs, they all have alveoli opening into them, and they serve the purpose of gas exchange. What is the target of this terminal respiratory bronchioles? Respiratory bronchioles are going to have alveoli opening into them, and the alveoli are these rounded structures, and then these alveolar ducts will open into alveolar sacs. Alveolar sacs, they have thousands of alveoli opening into them, and alveolar sacs are what? They are the last part of passages where alveoli will be opening into them, and alveolar sacs are not dividing anymore. Why? Because we have already so many divisions. There are around 22 sets of divisions to reach the alveolar sacs. In order to hit the target very well in the center, what is called bullseye, it is not enough to have passages bringing good air to fill the alveoli. You also need blood vessels to come and approach these alveoli, surround them as you can see in the image, and the process of exchange of gases will happen. In this case, this is called the pulmonary circulation, and the blue vessels are coming from the right ventricle through the pulmonary arteries. So the blue vessels here are the pulmonary arteries, and when blood becomes oxygenated, it returns to the left atrium as the pulmonary veins. Here is our target area. What is our target area? It is an alveolus, having what? Having good air, full of oxygen. And what is next? It should be surrounded, as you can see, with capillaries. The blue ones are the deoxygenated blood coming from the pulmonary arteries, and if you follow the arrows, you can see that there is a gas exchange, and the red vessels are the pulmonary veins. What should I notice in this image? I should notice that there is very close proximity between the blood vessels and the alveolus. They are lying on the alveolus. Our target area should be explained very well. Now, what is this figure? This figure is what is called blood-air barrier. This is very important. It is what separates air in the alveolus and RBCs in the capillaries. Now, here is a blood capillary with an RBC, and here is air in the alveolus, and the alveolus is lined with cells called pneumocytes. They are simple squamous epithelium, as you can see at the tip of this arrow. Then we have on the other side the endothelial cells of capillaries. You can see at the tip of this arrow. Epithelial cells must have basement membrane, so the lining of the alveoli, the pneumocytes, are epithelial cells, and they should have a basement membrane represented by dark blue lines underneath the pneumocytes, and the endothelium of capillaries also must have a basement membrane, and the two basement membranes become very close to each other, and very little small interstitial space between the two basement membranes. Here is at the tip of the arrow the very small interstitial space. Now we know how we are going to divide the respiratory system, and we know what is our target. This is an overview of the respiratory system. These are our objectives, and we are going to address these structures. First of all, the divisions of the respiratory system. There is an anatomical division, and there is a physiological division. First, we will address the nose, the uppermost part of the respiratory system in the face, and then we will address the pharynx, which is in the neck, and next is the larynx, or the voice box. These are, according to anatomical divisions, they are the upper respiratory system. Then the trachea, or what is called the windpipe, and the trachea is going to divide so many times, around 22 times, to give bronchi, and at the end of the bronchi we have bronchioles, and then we have the terminal bronchiole, and then the respiratory bronchiole, and we will be addressing the lungs, their blood supply and nerve supply and lymphatics, and then what regulates the respiratory system. These are what we are going to look into, and these are our objectives. What is this image? We have seen this image. It is a sagittal view of the cerebral hemispheres and the brain. Why are we talking about this subject in the respiratory system? Because there are respiratory centers. Where are these respiratory centers? They are in the bones and in the medulla oblongata. These centers are very important for respiration. They initiate respiration, and they go through the cycle of inspiration and expiration, and this is a very important subject. Why it is important? Because hard drugs, and you know what are hard drugs? Hard drugs are the illegal drugs that are used by addicts. These drugs, they depress these centers, and whenever they have an overdose, they will start breathing in less frequent times, and their blood is not oxygenated, and they go into coma and die. Time to write notes. The respiratory system divisions are two. They are either anatomical or physiological. And the anatomical divisions of the respiratory system are either upper part, which is above the vocal cords and includes the larynx, the pharynx, and the nose, while the lower respiratory passages are below the vocal cords and includes trachea, bronchi, so many bronchioles, almost 22 divisions of these bronchioles, and at the end we have alveoli. Now, the physiologists have a different idea. How do they divide the respiratory system? They say first it is the conducting part, in which it is made of tubes and cavities, and there is no exchange of gases. Any part which does not have alveoli is a conducting passage, and the respiratory part is where alveoli, and the presence of alveoli means gas exchange. So the respiratory part in the eyes of physiologists are the passages that will start having alveoli opening into them, and these passages start from the respiratory bronchioles, as we have seen in the previous slides, and the alveolar sacs and alveolar ducts, and it is where gas exchange happens. So the basis of the physiological classification is no exchange of gas or exchange of gas. Let's have a short idea about the first part of the respiratory system, which is what? It is the nose. Where's the nose? It's in the face. And what are the basic facts about the nose? And that is, it has a skeleton. This skeleton is made of what? It is made of bones and cartilages. And there is an external nose, the nose that we can see in faces of people, and there is an internal nose, a cavity inside the face. And these two parts, they have openings. The external nose opens, and the openings are called what? They are called the external nares. And the internal nose opens into the nasopharynx, and the openings are called the internal openings. And in general, the nasal cavity is divided into two cavities, right and left, and this division takes place by the nasal septum. What is this view? This is an anterior view of the skull. The face, which is the upper part of the orbital margin, has 4 openings, 2 orbits for the 2 eyes, and the middle a nasal cavity, and below is the oral cavity. Inside this circle you can see the internal cavity of the nose, the internal part, where you can see a nasal septum dividing the cavity into halves, and you can see here is a bone projecting into the nasal cavity. This is called a concha or a turbinate bone, and this is something we are going to see in the next few slides. What are the external features and the external names of the different parts of what we see of the external nose? First of all, if we look at the area between the 2 eyebrows, this is the beginning or the root of the nose, and then as it comes down, it is the bridge of the nose, and then we have the ala of the nose, the most lateral part of the external nares or external opening. This is called ala of the nose, and the tip of the nose is called the apex, and the openings of the nose cavities, they are called external nares, or another name, they are called nostrils. 2 nostrils, and below the middle of the nose is part of the upper lip called the philtrum. This view has 2 images. One is lateral and one is frontal, and it shows so many facts. It shows that the external nose, or what we see of the nose, is made of cartilages and bone. The bone is something we know by now, which is the nasal bone, but the cartilaginous part is made of different cartilages of different sizes. Here is the upper lateral cartilage. It is inferior to the lacrimal bone, and the 2 meet in the middle, and they are large one. And then lower lateral cartilages, these are also large ones, and they represent the anterior part of the nares, and there are several small cartilages. This is another view of the skeleton of the external nose. And what is this part of the nose? This is, as a description, it is the lateral part of the lowest part of the external nose, and this is made by a cartilage called greater alar cartilages. What is this image showing me? First of all, it is showing that the nasal cavity divided by a nasal septum has an upper end or a roof. This is called the roof of the nose, and the floor of the nose is wider, so it is pyramidal in shape, and the nasal septum, which is made of bones and cartilages, divides the nasal cavity into two cavities. And as you can see, the nasal cavity is not a uniform cavity. It has bone projections into the cavity. Here is a superior projection made by the bones that makes the lateral wall of the nose, and this is the ethmoid bone. And here is a bony projection, and this is called the superior turbinate bone. And the middle one, also projecting into the cavity, it also belongs to the ethmoid bone, and it is called the middle turbinate bone. And then the inferior one near the floor is the largest, and it is a separate bone, does not belong to any bone of the nose, and it is the inferior turbinate bone. Turbinate bones, the three of them, they have another name. What is this another name? It is the concha as a singular and conchi as plural. Underneath each turbinate bone there is a space. This space is called a meatus. So there is one inferior to the superior turbinate, another one inferior to the middle, and the lowest one is inferior to the inferior turbinate bone. This is a sagittal view showing the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. What is this part? The first part opening into the external nares and covered by the alar cartilage, and it has hair in the skin of this area, and this is called the vestibule. And then this is the inferior turbinate or inferior concha, and this is the middle concha, and this is the superior concha. As you may have noticed that the middle and the superior conchae, they are meeting anteriorly, and as they go posteriorly they become separate identities. The floor of the nasal cavity is the roof of the mouth, which is made by the maxilla and posteriorly by the palatine bone. Then we have the roof. The roof is dome shaped, first of all made of cartilage and then nasal bone, and as they reach the apex of the top, there you find the cribriform plate of the ethmoid, and here you can see the olfactory mucosa and olfactory receptors, and then the dome will continue down posteriorly in front of the sphenoid air sinus, and as it reaches the nasopharynx, we have a collection of lymphoid tissue called the adenoids. I am showing you this lateral part of the nasal cavity with blood vessels. Now, why I am showing you this? Because there are multiple arteries that are going to supply the lateral wall of the nasal cavity, and when there is dryness or a problem in the lateral wall, the nose is going to bleed. This image may looks strange to you, and it is a CT scan of a coronal view of the face, where you can see that here is the nasal septum, and this is the orbit, and underneath it is the maxillary air sinus, and the nasal septum continues up, and you know which bone is this. This is the inferior concha or inferior turbinate, and then this is the middle turbinate part of the ethmoid bone, and this is the nasal cavity in between the septum and the conchae, and the superior conchae is not in this section. What is this? This is the nasal septum. What does it make? It makes the medial wall of the nasal cavity, and it is made of a bony posterior superior part of the ethmoid bone, and then a separate bone called the vomer makes the lower posterior part of the nasal septum. These are the two bony parts of the nasal septum, and then you have the septal cartilage making the continuity of the nasal septum. Even the alar cartilage makes most anterior and inferior part of the nasal septum. The floor is made by the palatine process of the maxilla anteriorly and part of the palatine bone posteriorly. What is this view? This is the lateral wall of a nasal cavity, and what do I see? I see this dark blue bone, a separate bone attached to the maxilla, which is the inferior turbinate bone or inferior concha, and upstairs you can see this green structures. They are the middle and superior conchae. They meet anteriorly, and as they go posteriorly they separate, and they are part of the ethmoid bone. Does the palatine bone, the posterior part of the hard palate, form any part of the nose? The answer is yes. It makes posterior part of the floor of the nasal cavity and part of the lateral wall. What is this view? This is still the lateral wall of a nasal cavity, and what is different about this view is that the middle and inferior conchae have been cut and removed. Why this is done? It is done to expose structures in the middle meatus, the space inferior to the middle concha, and this is the middle concha cut, and you can see a bulging underneath, a bulging into the meatus. This bulging is called polyethmoidalis. It is made by the middle ethmoid air sinuses, and underneath this polyethmoidalis you see a sulcus, and this sulcus is called hiatus semilunaris because it is like half lunar shape, and into this hiatus semilunaris the maxillary air sinus opens into it, and the frontal and other nasal sinuses except the sphenoid. The sphenoid air sinus opens into the superior space under the superior concha. This is again the same view as the previous slide, where you can see the middle concha has been cut to visualize the middle meatus, and you can see the polyethmoidalis and the hiatus semilunaris. Solid parts of cranial bones and facial bones, they have cavities called sinuses, and they are extensions of the nasal cavity into these bones, and they are called paranasal sinuses on both sides of the nose, nasal cavities, superior part, and this is sphenoid air sinuses, and this is the most troublemaker sinus in the facial bones, and it is the maxillary sinus. And why is it troublesome? Because if you look into this circle, you can see that this sinus opens superiorly into the hiatus semilunaris. Therefore, if there is any inflammation or fluid or pus, it is going to accumulate and in the sinus, and is going to cause lots of pain and discomfort. It is not drained at the most dependent part, and you can see that the opening is in the middle meatus, and it is in the superior part of the sinus. This is an image showing what? It is showing that the skin of the nose has multiple sources of blood supply, and therefore wounds of the nose bleed. And this image is also telling me that there are what is called intrinsic muscles of the nose. These are rudimentary in the human, and they are not working and rarely present. This is the multiple sources of nerve supply to the nose. We have now collected good knowledge about the nose. And what is next? The next is that the nose opens into the upper part of the pharynx, which is called the nasopharynx. The nasopharynx is inferior to the base of the skull and posterior to the nose. The lower part or the middle part of the pharynx opens into the mouth, and it is called the oropharynx. And the lowest part of the pharynx is called the laryngopharynx. It is posterior to the larynx, and it opens into the beginning of the respiratory passages, and that is the larynx or the voice box. What is this view? This is a posterior view of the pharynx, showing that it is made of 3 constrictor muscles. They meet posteriorly in the midline. This meeting line is called pharyngeal raphe. Now, if we open the posterior wall of the pharynx, we are going to see the posterior opening of the nasal cavity, the posterior nares, and then we can see the posterior third of the tongue. This is where the mouth opens into the pharynx, and then we can see the opening of the larynx made by a cartilage called the epiglottis. This is the opened posterior wall of the pharynx, and you can see that this green structure. What is this green marked structure? It is the epiglottis, the cover of the larynx, or the first valve of the respiratory system. When you swallow something, this epiglottis comes down and closes the larynx so that food can come down into the esophagus. When you are not swallowing, or when you are breathing, of course, this epiglottis opens and air gets into the larynx. This is a frontal view of the neck, where we can see that the base of the larynx is a cartilage, a complete ring of cartilage called the Trichoid Cartilage. And then superior to the cricoid and articulating with the cricoid is the Thyroid Cartilage. The common name of this cartilage is Adam's apple. And then the whole of the larynx is attached to the hyoid bone. And you know the hyoid bone is a horseshoe bone within the horseshoe shape of the mandible. Now, you can see that there are gaps between these 3 bones, and these gaps are filled with fibrous membranes, and the name of these membranes is composed of the 2 names of the 2 cartilages, or the cartilage and a bone. What do you call the membrane between the thyroid cartilage and the hyoid bone? It is called the thyrohyoid membrane. we want to construct the larynx is made of cartilages, membranes, and ligaments. The base of the larynx is made by this blue colored cartilage, which is the cricoid. This cricoid, inferiorly, it sits on the first ring of the trachea, and superiorly it articulates with the thyroid cartilage. In this image, we can see that the thyroid cartilage sits and articulates with the cricoid cartilage. This is the epiglottis. When we open the mouth and depress the tongue, we can see the tip of epiglottis, the cover of the larynx. This is the closer view at the posterior part of the mouth, where inferiorly you can see the posterior 1/3 of the tongue, and you can see the epiglottis. When you see the epiglottis in this position, it means that the larynx is opened. If you follow this image, you go inferiorly and you see the epiglottis turned up, and the superior part of the larynx is exposed, and you can see in the middle the V-shaped structure, which are the two vocal cords opened. They are separated from each other. In this image, you can see that the two vocal cords are closer to each other, but they are never closing the inlet, otherwise the person will die. Now, the base of the larynx is the cricoid cartilage. It is the first complete ring of cartilages in the larynx. No other cartilage is made as complete ring. But in this slide, we are looking at the arytenoid cartilages. These are pyramidal in shapes, and they have an anterior process called vocal process for the vocal cords to attach to, and we have a muscular process in which muscles insert here, and they move the arytenoid cartilages to move the position of the vocal cords, and they have an apex. Now, we take this arytenoid cartilage and makes it sits on the cricoid cartilage, and they have a special facet for this purpose, and we can see that the vocal process is pointed anteriorly to attach the vocal cords. This is a view of the thyroid cartilage. What is this lateral structure of the thyroid cartilage? It is the left lamina. It is the widest part, and there is a right lamina on the posterior side. And then there is the superior thyroid notch between the two laminae, and one can put his finger and feel this notch. and there is at the inferior part of the notch, which becomes the most prominent anterior part, and this is called the laryngeal prominence. And at the lower part of the lamina anteriorly, there is what is called the inferior thyroid notch. These are the lateral and anterior parts of the thyroid cartilage. Then we have a process extending superiorly, and this is called the superior horn, and an inferior horn. This inferior horn is going to articulate with the cricoid cartilage by a facet on its lateral broad side. Then we have between the superior horn and inferior horn, on the posterior part of the lamina, we have a prominent line called oblique line. To your right is a sagittal section of the larynx and upper part of the trachea, where you can see this structure. What is this structure? This is the vocal process of arytenoid cartilage. And what is this? This is the middle part of the lamina of the thyroid, and the vocal cord extends between these 2 points. What are these 2 points? They are the vocal process of arytenoid and the inner surface of the midline of thyroid cartilage. Now, what covers the larynx is a cartilage called epiglottis. It is a leaf-like structure attached to the inner surface of the midline of thyroid cartilage. Now, this is a view of the larynx, and if you look inside this circle, you can see the point of attachment of the epiglottis to the thyroid cartilage. Question: where is the attachment of the epiglottis? Answer: the inferior pointed part will be attached to the inner surface of the midline of thyroid cartilage. What are these 2 green structures? To conclude, what are these? They are first pyramidal in shape, and they have anterior process pointing anteriorly, and they are sitting on top of the cricoid cartilage. Posteriorly, the broad part of the cricoid cartilage. Conclusion is that these are the 2 arytenoid cartilages. Question: what is this green marked structure? It is a process coming down from the posterior part of the lamina of the thyroid cartilage, going down to the side of the cricoid cartilage and articulating with it. Therefore, this is the inferior horn of the thyroid cartilage. Let us have a look at an opened larynx, and we can see that it has a true vocal cord and a vestibular fold or false vocal cord, and there is a space between these 2 folds called the ventricle. This is a deep recess that has lots of mucus glands that secretes mucus, which wets the vocal cords, because air is going in and out on the vocal cords, and they get dry very easily. So they are lubricated by secretions of mucus glands in the ventricle.